This comprehensive and powerful analytical tool will allow you to fully understand the profound and far-reaching effect that an unexpected or significant income shock to a specific segment of the population has on the overall income distribution, the level of economic inequality, the prevalence of poverty incidents, and the intricate distribution among various social classes within a given society. On the left-hand side of your screen, you will find a comprehensive set of options designed to meticulously describe which specific segment of the population will ultimately receive the intended shock, along with the precise total monetary amount of this particular shock. In this very first and crucial selection, you are able to clearly define the absolute highest level of educational attainment achieved by all the individual members within the household unit. For example, if you carefully select the categories of very low and low, you are effectively choosing a specific segment of households where the highest educational level attained by any member does not exceed primary school education, which is a fundamental level of schooling. In this second section, you must carefully select and indicate whether the household's primary income source comes mainly from informal labor income sources, which typically involve unregistered work or self-employment, or from formal labor income sources, which generally include salaried employment with official contracts and benefits. In this third and important section, you can precisely select whether the households significantly affected by the shock are from predominantly rural or densely populated urban areas. Let's leave the rural area selected. And finally, in this last section, you will be able to select the level of the shock. That is, the percentage of income that will be lost by those households with the selected characteristics. Let's select an income shock of about 40%. What do you think will happen to income distribution, inequality, and poverty in that case? Will they increase, decrease? What will happen to the Gini coefficient inequality? Those are the questions you will be able to answer. Here we can see that after the shock to this population with low educational levels, informal incomes, and living in the rural sector, the income distribution shifts to the left. What does this mean? That compared to the original income distribution, there is now a higher incidence of poverty. Notice that this particular part of the income distribution curve significantly widens, clearly indicating that a substantially larger percentage of the overall population now has incomes that fall below the established poverty line. At the very bottom of this comprehensive analysis, we also clearly observe that the overall and significant effect on the entire distribution of income levels is a noticeable and substantial decrease in the actual income levels effectively reached by the general population as a whole. In this particular and highly detailed part of the simulator, you can clearly and distinctly observe the original, pre-existing median income levels and the corresponding average income levels for this specific and diverse population. You will undoubtedly observe that the median income significantly falls, and, in a similar fashion, the mean income also does indeed decrease as well. Now let's see what happens with inequality. You probably already have an idea of what might be happening. The first thing the change in inequality clearly shows us is its effect on the Gini coefficient. We can see that the original Gini coefficient, which was already high at 0.524, rises to a level of 0.538. Although it may not initially seem like a very substantial change in inequality, for a population that already had significantly high levels of inequality, an increase of these crucial Gini points is indeed quite significant. In this third tab, you can clearly see how the entire population is distributed among the various social classes both before and after the impactful shock. By carefully hovering over these distinct areas, you will then be able to readily see the profound effects of movement between social classes. For example, if you hover over this line, you will see what portion of the high-income population remained in the high-income group. And here, practically the entire high-income population remained in the high-income group. In other words, the shock did not affect those high-income families. Indeed, where the profound shock had its most significant and devastating impact was precisely on this particularly vulnerable population. To finish, let's simulate a shock to the opposite segment of the population, that is, households with a high level of education, formal income, and living in urban areas. Here, we need to completely clear our initial selection before proceeding. With regard to the education level, please select higher and very high or advanced education levels. As for the income source, please select formal income. Deselect the rural areas and carefully select the urban regions, and then apply a significant shock, quite similar to the one we previously utilized in our initial simulation. We will now proceed to apply this particular simulation and then observe precisely what effect it ultimately had. We see an interesting effect on the income distribution. Now, a portion of the population that was in the high income bracket will shift to the left. In other words, what we see is that this part of the distribution becomes more populated. That is to say, the total number of individuals who are living below the established poverty line significantly increases. And fundamentally, another truly interesting and noteworthy phenomenon we observe is that the average income levels of the very last percentile of the entire distribution, or indeed of the final few percentiles of the overall distribution, tend to dramatically drop. The mean and median income of this population fall more significantly than in the first type of shock because these affected households have higher incomes. Therefore, the median income drops much more significantly than it does in the first type of economic shock. Now, let us look at what precisely happens with income inequality. Here, we observe something quite interesting and noteworthy, which is that now the Gini index significantly decreases. That is to say, the level of inequality within this particular society is demonstrably going to decrease. We transition from an initial Gini index of 0.524 to a final Gini index that is clearly below 0.5. This profound effect of reduced inequality is directly and intrinsically related to the substantial impact of the economic shock on the wealthiest segment of the population. Notice how the Lorenz curve now progressively gets much closer to the theoretical line of perfect equality. This visual representation clearly illustrates the positive shift in wealth distribution. And we can already imagine what happens with poverty and vulnerability. The economic shock does not significantly affect the lowest income households, that is to say, the households that were already experiencing poverty. Most or all of the households that were poor remain in poverty. However, a very significant portion of upper-class households, those with higher socioeconomic standing, frequently move into the vulnerability zone. This means quite specifically that some of the households that were previously considered vulnerable or at risk, unfortunately, fall into a state of poverty. So notice now, what other interesting idea comes to your mind? What other comprehensive simulation or scenario could we potentially conduct or explore?